There's been a lot going on in the media and on social media around some pretty high profile people and their thoughts on therapy and no contact. And I have some thoughts and reactions to it as well. And there's one important thing that I haven't heard people really talk about that I think is important for the majority of people who might be watching this video. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. So, the first thing is a recent podcast that Oprah did in which she talked about the trend of going no contact. Now, I definitely have some thoughts about that. And the second thing was Mel Robbins coming out with an article in the New York Times talking about life being too short to fight with your family or something along those lines. And then most recently, somebody that I'm not very familiar with at all, Scott Galloway wrote a piece, I think for his own blog maybe, talking about therapy not really being necessary, I guess. I did actually read it, but I don't remember everything that he said. I just remember my thoughts as I was reading. So I wanted to talk just kind of a little bit about overall my thoughts around that. And then I do want to get into a particular piece that I'll kind of talk a little bit more about afterward. So if you have followed me for any length of time, you probably know, especially if you follow me for a long time, you probably know that I've had my issues with things that Oprah has talked about over the years. I think she's done a tremendous amount of good in a lot of ways throughout her more public career since starting her own show. However, there are a lot of times that she has talked about things in a way that I don't agree with. And not only do I not necessarily agree with what she's saying, but I think that how she presents it can be incredibly misleading and even potentially dangerous because people listen to her and they know that she's had numerous experts over the years on her show. She's covered lots of really important topics. And so as a society, a lot of people look to her as kind of really valid information, opinions, and ideas. But she gets it wrong when she's sharing her ideas about things and talks about it in a way that is things that we do or don't do, things that we should or shouldn't do, the ways that the world works, the ways that psychology and mental health work, those kinds of things. She often gets it wrong or at least misses a lot of important nuance within it. And so there's risk then in people just kind of buying into it. And this is why I have said for so long that it's so important to really think about who we are getting information from. And that doesn't mean that there isn't value in things that she might be saying. But when she's talking about things related to psychology, mental health, abuse, relationships, she doesn't know. She doesn't have the depth of understanding and, again, nuance that is really important to understand when you are telling millions of people how to think, how to feel, what to do, what not to do. So that applies to her. It applies to Mel Robbins. It applies to Scott Galloway. It applies to people across the board. And the same is true for medical advice. The same is true for electrical advice, right? Like well, I think you should probably hire an electrician generally, but if you're watching a YouTube video to figure out how to try to do something, it's probably better to watch a video of somebody who is an actual trained electrician versus somebody who does some side DIY projects while they're remodeling their home on their own, right? So when there's something that requires expertise, or when there is something that people are sharing, that expertise is important in the context of what they're sharing. If they don't have expertise in that, it doesn't mean don't listen to them. It doesn't mean don't watch them. It just means think of them as a friend who's sharing their thoughts and opinions. That's simply it. And I've not specifically talked about Mel Robbins because, to be quite honest, I haven't found a reason to really pay much attention to Mel Robbins. And I don't mean that in like a really particularly negative way. I just haven't felt like she necessarily had anything particularly valuable to offer that I thought would be helpful with sharing with other people, I guess is maybe a good way to put that. And I definitely had some issues with the whole let them theory that wasn't apparently actually her theory, but which is a whole other issue. But in this article that she recently came out with, talking about life being too short, and again, I didn't read it, so I can't go into a lot of specifics here. But what I would say about this is that she has no training, no expertise, probably no real life experience that gives her any sort of authority to tell you that life is too short and you shouldn't be fighting with the people in your family. And it's really kind of as simple as that. I believe her expertise, her training and education, I believe she was a lawyer. And then for the other article, which is not related to the no contact thing specifically, apparently I had to look him up because I'm not familiar with him, but I have seen his name quite a bit in the realm of things related to emotional well-being and mental health. So I anticipated that he had some sort of background in something related. Turns out he doesn't. He apparently is a marketing person. But in this article, he did talk about how there's a lot of therapy speak and that can create some difficulty. And I would say that I agree with him. And I've talked about that a little bit before in regards to people, just regular everyday people sharing their experiences, which I think is really helpful. And I've talked about that too. It is a really important thing for us to be able to hear about other people's experiences and what works or doesn't work for them. But in what he is talking about, he talks about the fact that it's also unaffordable. And I agree with him. And the whole medicalization of mental health is a big part of the problem. But to be honest, I think that years ago, decades ago, that is part of what also gave it a little bit more legitimacy, because it was part under like the medical umbrella instead of just this woo-woo sort of thing. Now, obviously, it helped in some ways, but has hurt in a lot of other ways. So I also kind of agree with him in some of that. However, he talked about a lot of things, and he was, I think, more specifically talking about young men. And he kept referring to, we don't need therapy because only a certain percentage of the population has mental illness. And him describing it in that way shows his lack of understanding, his ignorance in all reality around what therapy is, why somebody would seek therapy, and what the actual process and benefits of therapy are. Because yes, people with an actual mental illness can benefit from therapy. But therapy is not purely for people with mental illness or even specifically a diagnosis of something specific, because everybody is wounded. And when we don't understand what those wounds are, it is going to continue to show up in our life and not only affect us, but affect those around us in one way or another, and oftentimes in more than one way. It even affects economy, because in whatever way it's affecting us, how is that showing up in terms of our work, in terms of the kind of work we choose to do, in terms of how we spend or save money or invest money, or like it affects all kinds of things. So again, just whomever it may be that you are listening to, what are their qualifications to talk about this from a place of authority? And if they don't have those qualifications, think of it as a friend. If they do have the qualifications, think, okay, this is a perspective, and this is an interesting way to think about it. And let me sit with that for a little bit and listen to other people that also have authority in what they are speaking about. I would never want somebody to watch one of my videos or even 5 of my videos and take what is in those 5 videos and look at that as absolute, and that it's 100% the only way to look at something. It's important that we have different types of perspectives and viewpoints to help us be able to discern what feels true to us, and being able to trust in the people that have some sort of expertise in something, right? Like going back to the idea of an electrician, you might see 2 different qualified electricians go about something in a little bit of a different way. And maybe one is more appealing to you than the other. One just feels simpler. One feels more thorough, whatever it might be. And you can follow that. And then if you happen to see a 3rd and 4th electrician and they fall more to one side than the other, okay, now I'm hearing it again in a similar way, or seeing it done in a similar way. I think I'm going to lean more towards this. We get to kind of decide that, but it's important that we're making the decisions based on information that we have more likelihood, or that has a more likelihood of being based in deep understanding, recognizing the complexities and nuance, particularly when it comes to humans and how we think and how we feel and what we need and don't. So I want to go ahead and get into the other part. And if you are somebody who is setting boundaries, particularly with people that you've had in your life for a long time, if you are somebody who is considering, and I don't know why, but no contact, I don't know, that term, for some reason, I don't love it. And I'm not quite sure why exactly. But to me, going no contact is just setting a firm boundary. Because I think I think this is an important conversation and understanding to have, and being able to recognize that it doesn't have to be, generally speaking, sometimes it does, generally speaking, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I think part of healing, part of healthy human interaction, relationships, and boundaries, there's going to be some middle ground there, whether it's with family, a coworker, a friend, whomever it might be. And so I think it's important to recognize that when it comes to boundaries, and no contact is a boundary. When it comes to boundaries, it's not black and white. It's not all or nothing, or it doesn't have to be, with some exceptions. And when I say some exceptions, I mean that could apply still to a whole lot of people. But just there are some exceptions in which no contact is going to be the thing that's likely going to be the best thing. So towards the end, at the end of this podcast that Oprah did, she had somebody on, and I've actually seen a video of this person before, who is a hospice nurse. And this person, I think Lindsay was her name. I don't remember anybody else's name, but I remember her name. Lindsay was talking about her. Oprah was asking about what she does with a lot of patients, or what ends up happening. And for a lot of people that have been estranged from their adult children, she said at the end of their life, they will often ask about like trying to contact their adult child, and that oftentimes the adult child doesn't want to engage. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, oftentimes they still want to know. So she offers to reach out to them when that person actually does die. And she said that oftentimes, and I think most times actually, if I remember correctly, that they do want to know that. And I'm not surprised by that, because the not knowing is really hard around all kinds of things in life. So I'm not surprised by that. And I think she said that she was, but one of the things that was kind of talked about is guilt. And Lindsay thought that part of the reason that estranged parents wanted her to reach out to their children is a little bit for a guilt trip. And she also mentioned at one point about the adult children, having guilt. And I don't remember exactly how she talked about that, because this was over a week ago, I think, that I watched this video, or about a week ago. But this is the part that I think is kind of lost in a lot of this. The choice to set such a firm and hard, clear boundary in which you are no longer communicating with somebody, that is not an easy thing to do. It's not easy emotionally. It's not easy in practice. But the idea that if we make the right decision, whatever that might mean to any given person, that if we make the right decision, then we're less likely to feel guilty. Generally speaking, I don't think that that's true. And I think it's really important that people understand that, because it is one of the fears that people have so often. In fact, I would say probably everybody I've ever known who has considered creating firm boundaries, whether it's no contact whatsoever or very, very limited contact, one of the things that we end up talking about is guilt. And whether it's, what if I feel guilty after they die? Or what if I make the last years of my parents' life so much more difficult than it needs to be, and I feel guilty about that? So there's a lot of different pieces of guilt that can be present. But one thing about grief, and even if you have no contact with a family member, knowing that they are gone or just ending the relationship, there is grief that is going to be present. And I feel pretty confident in being able to say that that's going to be true on some level for virtually everybody. Now, I can't think of a circumstance in which this would be the case, but I will leave a little possibility that maybe somebody doesn't have grief. Now, somebody may not call it grief. So they may say, I don't have any grief around it. But I think there's still likely going to be a process that's happening that is an aspect of a grieving process. So, because grief doesn't necessarily have to be solely about feeling sadness over a loss. There's a lot of feelings that can be associated in a grieving process. And so I think it's really important that people understand that the presence of guilt does not mean you're making a mistake. Whether that is setting a boundary with a coworker or cutting off all relationship with a family member. Because when it comes to setting boundaries, generally speaking, even like I said with a coworker, for the majority of people watching this video, guilt is likely going to show up. Maybe it's a little bit, maybe it's just occasional, but there's likely going to be some thoughts around something that cause you to feel some sense of guilt around setting that boundary. That unfortunately is a natural part of boundary setting for the majority of people. Now, the more we heal, the less likely that may be. But when it comes to family relationships, there's likely going to be some guilt that is there. Now, the guilt may show up after they've passed away, and it may show up years after they've passed away, but there's likely going to be some guilt. And it's so important to remember that that guilt does not mean that you were wrong in setting that boundary, whatever that boundary might look like. And this is also part of the reason why I think that, especially for people, when we're talking about family and we're talking about childhood trauma within the family, in those types of circumstances or where there's a lot of pain associated with a family system and you're setting boundaries, it is so important that when that guilt pops up, especially if maybe there's more healing to do or it's creating a lot of difficulty for you, you're having difficulty moving through that, you're not able to do some reality testing with it and feel the truth of that reality testing. This is where I think a lot of times it can be helpful to go back to therapy. Thinking about Scott Galloway's thing where therapy isn't really beneficial. And that doesn't require a diagnosis. It's certainly not about mental illness. But when you are dealing with the guilt of that, which is likely going to be inevitable, being able to process that is going to be incredibly important. Truly, it's going to be so incredibly important, because if it kind of gets stuck inside, even if you're not necessarily consciously thinking about it, it is going to have an impact on how you feel on an emotional level. It's going to have an impact on how you're showing up for yourself and potentially even other people, but most importantly, for yourself in your life. It can even have a significant impact on you physiologically, medically speaking, and what it does in terms of stress hormones, in terms of heartbreak, in terms of a lot of different potential things. So being able to work through that is really important, and work on trusting that decision, whatever that boundary might have looked like, is not wrong because you feel guilty about it. It certainly isn't wrong because other people are making you feel guilty about it. I've said this so many times before. Making the choice to set a significant boundary with somebody in which the relationship is so complicated. It is such a difficult decision. It is such a difficult thing to go through. And sometimes, if you're making that decision, it is likely going to be the healthiest decision for you. And trusting in that is not easy. But it's incredibly important. So, again, two different things that I hope you are able to take away from this. And one is just be really mindful of who you're internalizing information from when it comes to people on the internet, no matter how well known they might be, or how many followers they have, or whatever the case might be. And the second thing is that it can feel really, really incredibly lonely when you are working on setting boundaries and taking care of yourself and protecting yourself and honoring what you need and honoring a sense of peace and freedom in your life. And know that you are not alone. Know that other people do not have to agree with it. Know that guilt is not an indicator that you're doing something wrong when it comes to this. In fact, for most people watching this, it's not going to be an indicator that you're doing something wrong, generally speaking. But especially when it comes to this, whether that person is still alive or whether they have passed away, guilt does not mean that you made the wrong decision. And I know that during this time of year, it can be so incredibly difficult. And that's part of why this kind of thing annoys me when people start talking about things that they really have no authority to talk about, that creates more difficulty for people. It makes me angry. So please know that you're not alone. And know that you have a right, and it's important to recognize that taking care of yourself, honoring what you need, creating boundaries so that you are no longer in a situation in which you are disrespected or continue to be hurt, that is healthy. And there are a lot of people in our world, in our own personal worlds, that aren't going to like when you start doing things that are healthy, because it's going to look different. It's going to feel different to them. And it doesn't make you wrong. So I would love to hear from you. If you read either of the articles, if you watched the podcast, and I will share links. The Mel Robbins thing is from the New York Times. So if you don't have a subscription, which is why I didn't read it, I don't have a subscription to New York Times, you won't be able to read it. But I'll share links in the description below if you're interested. But share your thoughts. Share what, especially if you did watch or read any of that and you had some thoughts as it came up, or you noticed yourself having a reaction, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.